So through a discussion of selected scenes, I'd like to invite us to consider how Everett reframes Twain's story, both to pay homage to his wit and dark humor and to challenge our views of race in 21st century America. This is a slide I use for teaching, so full disclosure, but it's one that I think works really well here as well. As Justin Kaplan explores in his wonderful biography, which I recommend if you haven't read it, Mr. Clemens and Mark Twain, the actual Samuel Clemens was not only a brilliant humorist and comic genius, but he was a profoundly divided man, a satirist whose adventurous spirit drove him to travel out west, whose hatred of pretension fueled his writing, and who married the wealthy Olivia Langdon. He proposed and failed at outrageous business ventures. He sought to embody with limited success the morality and ambition for wealth of the Gilded Age. From early in his career, he was extremely self-conscious about his place in the literary profession, especially given his lack of formal education. And there is much evidence to this fact, particularly a famous speech that he gave for the Whittier birthday address, in which he basically made a send-up of every Boston Brahmin in the audience, from Emerson to Longfellow and beyond. And it was carried in the papers the next day, and Twain afterwards called himself God's fool. But that was Mark Twain. Mark Twain was born sometime after the Civil War in Nevada, where Twain retreated after his failed skirmish as a Confederate soldier. Despite Clemens's suffering from imposter syndrome all his life, Mark Twain was nurtured by publishers, editors, and promoters, adopted by the American public as one of the most beloved authors of American literature. And these are just a few of course, Twain's many novels. And as a glance at these books reveal, Twain authored novels that really came from his experiences throughout his life as a silver miner, as a journalist, as a lecturer, as a steamboat captain in Life on the Mississippi. But they also explore some of the darkest sides of American life, particularly, I think, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and then the 1894 novel Pudd'nhead Wilson, which really provides a very devastating satire of the impact of race on two young children, one black, one white, who are switched at birth. So Huckleberry Finn upends truisms about the antebellum South, particularly its racial history. I'd like to go to the sources, and particularly the language that Twain uses and where it originates from. So the sources of Twain's novel, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, really appear in materials of the theater and literature that might have been its precursors. Several critics have identified the origins of the characters in the minstrel shows, which were common in the antebellum South. One critic, Eric Lott, claims in an influential argument that minstrel shows involve, as he says, the quite explicit borrowing of black cultural materials for white dissemination and profit, with the ultimate goal of displaying that slavery was amusing, right, and natural. Performed mainly by white actors in blackface, the minstrel shows depicted the racial stereotypes of superstitious, happy-go-lucky types, such as Mammy, Jezebel, and the tragic mulatto. Ethiopian dialogues were common, in which white actors put on blackface and imitated or caricatured the talking, singing, and dancing of enslaved persons and free people. Whereas Huck might be seen to be Mr. Interlocutor, the straight man, during his conversations with Jim, to his companions' humorously inept Bones, if you're familiar with those characters of the minstrel show. Everett deftly reverses this equation by having James only play at taking on this role. Southwest humor and the tall tale were additional important cultural sources for Twain. These are ones that he would have been exposed to out west and growing up in Missouri. They include bawdy episodes, and you might recall in Huckleberry Finn, the Rarey show, in which the king, after a kind of send-up of a Shakespearean soliloquy gone bad, runs out onto the stage, naked, painted with stripes, prancing on all fours. It's that sort of frontier humor that Mark Twain was very, very familiar with. But he was also familiar with plantation novels of the Old South, many of which depicted the period of slavery in nostalgic, almost idealized terms. And Twain himself recalled early in his career a sense of the South's more glorified past when he served as a steamboat captain who operated the Southern trade, what was called the Southern trade, which we recognize as the slave trade, in the 1850s. While life on the Mississippi includes some of these memories, he conspicuously does not deal directly with slavery, preferring instead largely to inhabit a nostalgic world of the antebellum South. So this is really Twain early on, experiencing this love of the South. Another key source for Everett's novel, however, comes from Twain's use of language and dialect. And Everett has admitted that he was indebted to Twain, of course, for the way in which Twain's language really captivates the reader. By the 1870s, Twain published several shorter pieces in the Atlantic that aimed to depict African American voices accurately. A true story repeated word for word as I heard it in November 1874, for example, provides the touching story of Aunt Rachel, a slave who recounts being separated from her 7 children, all in her own voice. Another short piece, entitled Sociable Jimmy, which was published in the New York Times in 1874, describes a conversation Twain had with a 10-year-old he describes as a little darky boy while on a lecture tour. Shelley Fisher Fishkin argues influentially that Sociable Jimmy represented one of Twain's first efforts to translate African American speech into print, and contends that he provides the basis for Huck's voice. There are other prototypes as well, though. Christopher Dowd also discusses Twain's use of ethnic origins, particularly the way he draws on Irish immigrant stereotypes he believes were the basis for Pap, claiming Twain, quote, never demonized the Irish, but his works do traffic in common Irish stereotypes. And it's some of those types of stereotypes that I think inform many of Edward Windsor Kemball's depictions. The pictures of Black characters, as you can see, particularly begin to question the ways in which African Americans are portrayed. The pictures of the Black character, Jim, are by Edward Windsor Kemball from the first edition in 1885, and they suggest the degree to which Huck and Twain needed to contend with racial stereotypes. According to at least one critic, the pictures create a narrative that runs counter to the developing relationship of Huck and Jim's growing friendship by reducing Jim to a racial stereotype. They portray Jim as a stock figure in an emerging pictorial tradition. So by the time Twain begins writing his novel in 1876, as Stephen Railton notes, slavery plays a much larger role in the story he tells, but how Huck Finn represents slaves and slavery becomes a very controversial question. So I just want to pause and think a little bit about whether these sources or images continue to resonate for us today. And if anyone has any thoughts about that, I welcome hearing them. I'm also happy to keep going. But what are any thoughts about the kinds of stereotypes or racial depictions in these images? They're ones that we seem to have left behind, and so I want to just remind us that racial stereotyping continues to exist in America, perhaps not as overtly as in these depictions, but certainly in portrayals of other ethnic types, particularly indigenous characters who appear in Twain's fiction as well. So Twain inhabits his character Huck's mind and voice in more complex ways than either the plantation novels or the racial caricatures or the Southwest humor tale that he drew from. He depicts a narrator who is, rather than a narrator who has been fully acculturated, he creates an outcast, an illiterate 12-year-old boy on the margins of society. For Leslie Fiedler, Tom is the good bad boy, the lovable rascal as a child who ultimately grows up to be the PTA president, that type. But Huck lives on the margins of society. Huck is the bad boy. He is the unredeemable. And in Twain's novel, like Everett's, the question of language and authority appears important from the very opening. This is the famous notice that Twain uses to warn the reader not to take the novel too seriously. He says, "Persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. Persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot. By order of the author per G.G., Chief of Ordnance." Standing behind the Chief of Ordnance, Twain lurks somewhere behind the figure of Huck and the more proper Victorian image of Samuel Clemens. From early in his career, Twain was very self-conscious, as we've said, about his place in the literary profession. He was also self-conscious about his use of language, as is evident from his famous explanatory, in which Twain claims to have represented almost a pseudo-scientific specification of dialect in his novel. He says, "In this book, a number of dialects are used, to wit, the Missouri Negro dialect, the extremist form of the backwoods Southwestern dialect, the ordinary Pike County dialect, and 4 modified varieties of this last. The shadings have not been done in a haphazard fashion or by guesswork, but painstakingly and with the trustworthy guidance and support of personal familiarity with these several forms of speech. I make this explanation for the reason that without it, many readers would suppose that all these characters were trying to talk alike and not succeeding." I think the very specificity of these supposed regional differences, combined with his parting shot, have the quality of the send-up and suggest to us that Twain was overtly using dialect. Now, for Everett, in James, language, as well as reading and literacy, become the key means by which James will create an identity for himself. Everett uses language as code switching, moving between standard English and dialect. He portrays James and other African American characters as performing in blackface for the white slave-owning public, while speaking, of course, in standard English with other African Americans. For James, it was a matter of survival. Not to do such would mean that he would be subject to the wrath and mistreatment of his owners. And so James, as a character, instructs early on children to translate their responses when in the presence of white people, as well as to behave in a way that would suggest their subservience to their white owners. And so this quote, "White folks expect us to sound a certain way, and it can only help if we don't disappoint them," I said. "The only ones who suffer when they are made to feel inferior is us. So let's pause to review some of the basics." "Don't make eye contact," a voice said. "Right, Virgil." "Never speak first," a girl said. "That's correct, February," I said. "What do we call that?" I asked. Together they said, "signifying." Now, as students of post-structuralist literary theory might realize, signifying is a word that acts as a nod to the influential theory of professor and critic Henry Louis Gates, who does the African Roots series on PBS television. You might know him from that. In signifying monkey, Gates uses a trickster figure from Yoruba culture to suggest that colonized peoples of color can redraw meaning by playing on, troping, or recasting the terms of the dominant culture. In an article that appeared recently in the New York Times, linguist John McWhorter contends that the idea that Black English was concocted as a kind of deliberate survival strategy, while satisfying to us, is inaccurate. Black English, he contends, originated when slaves were exposed to non-standard English dialects spoken by plantation owners and white indentured servants from Britain and Ireland. All true. Nevertheless, by portraying characters who alternate between standard English and really a heightened dialect, Everett confers on them a humanity they might otherwise have lost for us. Through his flawless depiction of dialect, he also, I believe, is engaging a 19th century literary tradition that, from Twain to Stowe, portrayed a linguistic reconstruction of Black speech for white readers. So, how does Everett move away from the depiction of African Americans that Jim embodies? Everett's novel evokes scenes that, for those of us who have read Huckleberry Finn, are clearly direct parallels to Twain's novel, and that display James's sophistication in ways that veer away from an African American caricature. To give you an example, in chapter 1, Tom and Huck steal Jim's hat and hang it on a tree limb, one of the many incidents where the two white boys find a way to play a joke on Jim. Jim responds by creating what Huck refers to as a stretcher, in which, and I won't read all of this, but you can see right here, in which Jim continues to tell the story again and again, always elaborating on and stretching the truth. And so initially he claims that the witches bewitched him and put him in a trance and rode him all over the state. But Huck says every time he told it, he spread it more and more, till by and by he said they rode him all over the world and tired him most to death, and his back was all over saddle boils. Twain's Jim uses the opportunity to fictionalize for the purpose of elevating himself as he spread the story even further from the truth. A stretcher might have some factual basis, but is ultimately an exaggeration, designed for some benefit to oneself or others. A lie, however, in Huckleberry Finn is malicious and has absolutely no redeeming value. In Everett's novel, James abhors superstition and only pretends that he believes his hat has been moved by witches. So, he says, my performance for the boys becomes a frame for my story. My story became less of a tale as the real game became the display for the boys. James also believes religion is a means of control, as he contends in answering a question from a Black child, Rachel, who says, why did God set it up like this, with them as masters and us as slaves? And James says, there is no God, child. There's religion, but there's no God of theirs. Their religion tells that we will get our reward in the end. However, it apparently doesn't say anything about their punishment. But when we're around them, we believe in God. Oh, loudy loud, we's be believin'. Religion is just a controlling tool they employ and adhere to when convenient. Far from being, of course, the superstitious, happy-go-lucky, enslaved person, James has, in reading Rousseau, Locke, and Voltaire, also imbibed the themes of natural rights and agnosticism. These incidents convey to the reader James's ability to move seamlessly between linguistic registers to code switch from blackface to standard English and back again. So again, I think that is it's a large difference from Twain, but I'm curious about whether that struck anyone in ways that would resonate with views of speech today, language today for you. Any views?
Actually, I haven't thought about it that way until you just said that last part about the switching today. that actually, that's sort of an intriguing way to look at it, because I found some of this switching to be,
Jarring?
yeah, it was a little bit, it would sort of interrupt my train of thought while I was sort of following the story, and I thought, I don't know if this is supposed to be symbolic and to get us to think about larger issues, but I felt like clearly it wasn't, I don't think, meant to be realistic in the sense that I don't think the community that he was living in, that pretty much anybody was reading Voltaire and that was a book on the library that nobody read, I think, in that the study. So that was sort of, I wasn't sure how we were supposed to absorb that, because I found that to be not a realistic aspect of it, but it was more symbolic.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear people thinking through this problem. I mean, when I teach novels like this, the hard thing for students is actually to read the dialect. And I think that's because it seems like such an exaggerated version of actual human speech. But it was a convention in the 19th century. I think Everett is intent on displaying the full humanity and interiority of his characters. And so for us as 21st century readers, it's very difficult to read the dialect and take it seriously.
Well, it's funny, because I had prepared myself for this by first reading, again, Tom Sawyer, then Huck Finn, then this. I was kind of exhausted, but I felt like that was a way to get back into what I knew was going to be a lot of dialect. So that was less distracting, and then there was this other layer that was I hadn't anticipated. So
yeah,
it just made it was an engaging experience.
Wonderful. Yeah.
I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, could this have happened? Like,
Mhm.
could James
Right.
have had access to these? I mean, he talked so much, which is this is in other books too of that time, like how precious any book is, because most people didn't have access to many books other than maybe a Bible, maybe not even that, right? So I spent a lot of time thinking, like, is there a world in which he learned to, because he wouldn't even be speaking necessarily like the people he was working for, that he was enslaved by, you know, and then also, like, Huck is clearly not like a privileged person, right?
Yes,
And-
right. And part of the irony in I think Huckleberry Finn is that you have a character, Huck, who occupies a kind of middle ground between a fully literate reader and someone like his father, Pap, who's completely illiterate.
Right.
So a lot of the irony in the novel is generated by the fact that we have Huck, who is a naive reader and not, marginal in the society in which he lives. I don't think it could exist in the same way were he not like that. I agree. I mean, there are debates certainly about the idea of Black English, right? About the fact that Black English occupies its own place with its own rules. But I think the question of literacy is really critical, because it's his ability to read and to write that become, for me, the central ways in which Everett portrays James's growing humanity. And that's and that you can see with, for example, Frederick Douglass,
Right.
who actually does learn to read strategically, right, opportunistically. So I think that there are parallels to be drawn, but the access also was something that he gets from Judge Thatcher's library. So I think these are very, very good questions. So let's get into that a little bit more. And I think one way to look at, again, the novel would be to consider episodes that derive directly from Huckleberry Finn. So structurally, I'm interested in the way that Everett, who claims that before he wrote this book, he reread Huckleberry Finn 15 times.
Wow.
So I don't know if you've read that. But I don't think it was so that he remembered it well. He did it deliberately so that he would blur and obscure the details to the point at which he felt as though he inhabited the world of Huckleberry Finn without the detail. Now, even having said that, one of the significant, I think, features is that many of these episodes that derive from Huckleberry Finn act as a counterpoint in James and highlight James's intelligence and humanity as he continues to gain more independence and agency. Some of those scenes closely echo Twain's novel, and to my mind play almost what Gates would call a call and response, a subversive technique that we see in African American literature. Some of the scenes include the one in which, for example, James imagines that a hairball can tell a fortune, or the plans that Tom has to create a band of robbers and others. What is significant is that these moments are registered through James's perspective rather than, again, through Huck's childlike, naive mind. To take another example, after Huck recounts the Grangerford and Shepherdson feud, which is takes up a couple of chapters in the novel that Twain writes, filled with all kinds of internecine warfare and two feuding families, and then a Romeo and Juliet story, right, between two characters from opposing families. That's abbreviated dramatically in James. Instead, Huck recounts just the bare details of the Grangerford and Shepherdson feud were told to James, who listened without much interest. And seeing that the child needed to play, he lets Huck take a canoe to explore while he meditates on the killing that actual slaves are subject to. He says, killing is, I thought I had a slide there, sorry. Killing is hard to see up close, especially for a child. To tell the truth, I hadn't seen much killing myself, except that I lived with it daily. The threat, the promise of it. Seeing one lynching was to see 10. Seeing 10 was to see 100, with that significant posture of death, the angle of the head, the crossing of the feet. In other words, he's become inured or hardened to the fact of death. He's seen it so frequently. So Everett's novel allows us to experience these episodes through the eyes of enslaved people, both before and during the period of the Civil War. Another one of the critical controversies to which Everett refers is the way that James and Huck travel down the Mississippi further and further into slave territory rather than up the Ohio to freedom. And you can see that, I think, on this map, right, where we have the Mississippi, where in chapter 12, Huck and Jim pass St. Louis, which would have been a point for them to move to freedom. Then in chapter 16, Huck and Jim pass Cairo, pronounced Cairo in the fog, in a section that is located in what was called Little Egypt, a place that parallels the story in Exodus in which the Israelites were led by Moses to freedom. And critics have speculated about the reasons why Twain would have changed his original intention and allowed them to travel deeper into slave territory rather than up the Ohio toward freedom. The problem appears to have flummoxed Twain. After completing about 400 pages of the novel in 1876, he stopped writing for 3 years around chapter 16, then resumed writing the manuscript in 1879, after which he wrote another 800 to 900 pages and concluded the novel. So why continue the story with the boy and man traveling deeper into slave territory? And I want to give a shout out to my old professor, Leslie Fiedler, who is the wild man of American literature. If any of you know his work, like Love and Death in the American Novel, which is truly one of the great books about American literature. For Leslie Fiedler, the answer was that Twain subconsciously wished to continue the novel that reminded him of his youth in Hannibal, Missouri. The most memorable aspect among so many mythic parts is the voice of Huck himself, according to Fiedler. And he says, and then one reads Huckleberry Finn again, hears, intermittently at least, a voice, which is neither Clemens's nor Twain's, but genuinely Huck's, which is to say, not the voice of a genteel sentimentalist or a clown in full makeup, but a boy Ishmael, the juvenile pariah of the village, idle and lawless and vulgar and bad. So while Huck Finn contains a mixed perspective told from the view of Huck, Twain, and Samuel Clemens, Everett's novel puts James at the center, exploring his feelings about family, his emotions, and his intellectual curiosity, as well as a persistent and undying desire for freedom. According to T.S. Eliot, another noteworthy critic, the river famously became a character in the novel. It is Huck who gives the book style, the river gives the book its form. It is the river that controls the voyage of Huck and Jim and that will not let them land at Cairo, where Jim could have reached freedom. True, Eliot has made an important point about the natural force that becomes the organizing principle of Huckleberry Finn. For Fiedler, however, Twain could continue reimagining the period of his youth as long as he was writing Huck and Jim's flight from civilization. Outside of time, the novel embodies a mythic male bonding that can take place only in nature and away from the domesticated world of women and the short-trained conscience that encourages conformity and tolerates racism. For Fiedler, this is Fiedler, nature undefiled, this is the inevitable setting of the sacred marriage of males. In his final lines of Huckleberry Finn, Huck seems more terrified of remaining with the widow Douglas and in Tom's world of good bad boys than of disappearing. And he says, but I reckon I got a light out for the territory ahead of the rest because Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I have been there before. By the 1840s, in fact, Huck's dream was already an impossibility. The territory of Oklahoma had already been settled. And with its quaint misspelling, the civilization, which begins with an S, that frightens Huck carries with it the terror of adult male responsibility and sexuality, as the term's nearness to syphilis implies, and the constant presence of violence and death. Now, turning back to Everett, if we consider the structural similarities between these two novels, then it's also clear that Everett reveals the way James uses reading and literacy as the means by which he will escape, both literally and figuratively. During the scene in which Huck and James come upon a steamboat wreck, James discovers and takes a stash of books, including ones by Voltaire, Locke, and Rousseau. He particularly has an interest, we can see, in 18th century philosophy. While reading the volumes in front of Huck required an elaborate ruse, he realizes reading is a subversive act. At that moment, the power of reading made itself clear and real to me. If I could see the words, then no one could control them or what I got from them. They couldn't even know if I was merely seeing them or reading them, sounding them out or comprehending them. It was a completely private affair and completely free, and therefore completely subversive. As James revels in the physical pleasure of holding Voltaire's Candide, he begins to read. In the country of Westphalia, I was somewhere else. I was not on one side of that damn river or the other. I was not on the Mississippi. I was not in Missouri. But if he is somewhere else in the experience of reading, he also lacks an identity, like Ellison's famous invisible man, who exists in a world that does not know his inner essence, nor recognize him as a human being. At the same time, James reveals his love for Huck, even as he shrewdly understands white psychology. In another echo of the fog scene, in which Huck plays a trick on Jim by pretending he's been present after being lost in the fog, James masterfully but gently allows the boy to feel his pain through humor. He says, I acted like he'd hurt my feelings. White people love to feel guilty. Besides imaginatively experiencing freedom and the sensation of being physically removed through books, reading and writing become for James the keys to actual liberation. Everett's novel omits several scenes, including chapter 14, in which Huck and Jim dispute the merits of King Solomon and speaking French. Whereas in Twain's novel, the scene can occur only through Huck's ability to read, Everett's James is the reader, and the tools of literacy are a pencil and a notebook that he has stolen from Daniel Decatur Emmett. And that may be part of the reason he omits some of those chapters, because Huck's reading is central there, whereas I think for Everett, the acquisition of literacy on the part of James and his ability to write is what will ensure that he has a life and an inner self. This rather startling image is the actual Daniel Decatur Emmett. Until I began to research this, I had no idea that there was an actual Daniel Decatur Emmett, but in fact, this was the writer of Dixie, the popular tune, and a songwriter who is credited with beginning the minstrel show. In a moment of truly spiraling irony, of course, James, in the novel, joins his minstrel troupe, in which he is obliged to perform in blackface. Filled with racist songs, Decatur's notebook acts as a script for their performances, which allows James to imagine the absurdity of his situation, he says. It occurred to me that there was no telling which side was free and which was slave. Then I understood that it really didn't matter. By taking the notebook, which also appears at the opening of the novel before the novel proper begins, James is appropriating the master's tools, like Frederick Douglass, who explains in his 1845 narrative that when left alone as a boy, he used to spend the time, he says, in writing in the spaces left in Master Thomas's copybook, copying what he had written, which seems to me like an act of rebellion and subversion, writing in between the spaces, in the interstices of what was already written. It also, though, frankly, the fact that the novel begins with the notebook and then begins the novel proper suggests that James is always toggling between these two worlds, between the world of the racist caricature of African Americans and between the fully developed human interior life that is coming into being. As a literary device, the notebook of Daniel Decatur Emmett foregrounds the fact that James's account of his life will resist and subvert the script he has been provided by antebellum America. And I just wanted to pause again to ask if any of these thoughts, particularly the idea perhaps of music, of its role, resonated with anyone here. Or the idea of language itself. So, yes, please.
The preface to the book I found jarring to read. It really, it sets the tone for the book, but it is,
Yeah.
it's frightening.
It's disturbing.
Yeah, it's disturbing, yes.
Yeah. I completely agree with you, and I had to sit with that for a little while
Yeah.
to think about why he would have done that. And I really, I'm beginning to think that as a literary device, you know, we know Everett is a postmodernist, and he is thinking about the ways in which there is no ultimate truth. There are only relative interpretations of one's place in the world, I think. And so to begin that way suggested to me that African Americans were already being defined in some way. That was literally the script that they were performing, but it's also the way they were thought to behave, to think, to use language. And so he's definitely, I think, putting that under critique.
Yes, it's a way of like imprisoning one with the caricature.
Yeah.
I think that's what struck me.
Yeah.
It was like how violent it was.
And it gets more, I think that's well put, and maybe we can come back to that in Q&A. I wanted to get to one other controversy, as well as to the question of Huck's identity, which changes quite a bit, as those of you who have read Huckleberry Finn recently would recognize. So particularly these three issues, the issue of time, namely when the novel is set, Huck's identity and background, and then what's called the evasion, which takes up the last 10 or 12 chapters in Twain's novel and is the elaborate, overdone, romanticized escape that Tom plans with Huck to set Jim free. So, first off, published in 1885 in America, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is set, as the title page tells us, 40 to 50 years ago, which would have been the time of Twain's youth, and you can see him here at the age of 15 when he was actually training to be a printer. For Twain, I think the setting of the novel at that time was designed perhaps to evade his actual experience of the Civil War, which is a kind of silent element throughout Huckleberry Finn. For Twain, the Civil War was traumatic. In the summer of 1861, Twain joined the Marion Rangers, a militia troop from Missouri, but after 2 weeks of continual rain, the lack of a central organized commander, and a taste of real war after coming in contact with General Ulysses S. Grant's men, Twain immediately deserted. I knew more about retreating than the man who invented retreating, Twain joked in later years. Everett's final 12 chapters differ dramatically from Huckleberry Finn in taking place during the Civil War, the beginning of the end of slavery. And in fact, the novel is set right around 1861. Everett, I believe, makes visible and real the experience that Twain avoided by setting his novel before the war, anticipating the actual future for African Americans during the period of Reconstruction. Structurally, Everett eclipses and reverses the last third of Twain's novel, beginning with chapters 31 to 43 of Huckleberry Finn, in which we discover that Jim is being held captive at the Phelps plantation, where Silas and Sally Phelps, who are Tom Sawyer's aunt and uncle, hold Jim captive. In the climactic scene in chapter 31 of Huckleberry Finn, Huck writes a letter to Miss Watson explaining where Jim is, only to be pulled the wrong way in the war between feeling and conscience, and tears up the letter to Miss Watson. And I'll read this. I felt good and all washed clean of sin for the first time I had ever felt so in my life, and I knowed I could pray now. But I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and sat there thinking how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell. And went on thinking, and got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the nighttime, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we a-floating along, talking and singing and laughing. But somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him, but only the other kind. It was a close place. I took it up, held it in my hand. I was a-trembling because I'd got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. As more sophisticated readers, we see the irony in Huck's decision that he must go the wrong way in the war of conscience when he convinces himself that he is willing to go to hell in a mock conversion experience, worthy really of St. Augustine, even if it means being known as a low-down abolitionist. Everett's novel does not invoke this famous scene, but rather places Huck in a world in which moral answers are hard to discern, rules are made to be broken, and identity is enacted rather than essential. There is a spoiler alert here, so if you have not finished the novel, I encourage you to get a drink of water. Okay, all right, I said my piece. Another major difference is that James tells Huck he is his son. Everett gives a new layer to the story. It is not only alcohol that makes Pap abusive, but his anger about the fact that his son has been fathered by a black man. Huck's interracial origins, while commonplace enough today, would have required a complete change in his way of life in the 19th century. But James also offers advice to Huck that affords him agency over his own life. Just keep living, I said. Just remember, once they see you or see me in you, you've been seen. I know you don't understand, but one day you will. So, the time of the evasion. The final controversy really involves Twain's elaborate portrayal of Jim's escape, which he terms an evasion, in which Tom and Huck subject Jim to an elaborate ruse to free him. While Huck comes to the Phelps plantation to free Jim, Tom stages the evasion, a term that suggests a lie, or the sidestepping of truth, not a stretcher. Based on romantic adventure novels Tom has been reading. His plans include a whole variety of scenarios, including giving Jim a case knife to dig his way out, giving him a plant to water with his tears, marking inscriptions on the walls, and so on. And for many readers, the concluding chapters seem pointless and excruciatingly long, except when one considers that they are the darkest of satires about the need to free a man who is already free, both naturally free and actually free, because Miss Watson has given him his freedom before she died. Subject to a variety of indignities at the hands of the boys, Jim has been made the butt of an elaborate joke, as this scene suggests, and I will read it. Jim said he would just as soon have tobacco in his coffee, and found so much fault with it, and with the work and bother of raising the mullein, and Jews harping the rats, and petting and flattering up the snakes and spiders and things, on top of all the other work he had to do on pens and inscriptions and journals and things, which made it more trouble and worry and responsibility to be a prisoner than anything he ever undertook. The Tom most lost all patience with him, and said he was just loaded down with more gaudier chances than a prisoner ever had in the world to make a name for himself. And yet he didn't know enough to appreciate them, and they was just about wasted on him. So Jim, he was sorry, and said he wouldn't behave so no more. And then me and Tom shoved for bed. And the final indignity, Tom, who carried with him a letter revealing that Miss Watson had set Jim free in her will, proclaims, "They hain't no right to shut him up. Shove, and don't you lose a minute. Turn him loose. He ain't no slave. He's as free as any creature that walks the earth." In contrast, James recovers agency and power for its central character during a revenge fantasy that could never be part of Huckleberry Finn. Everett's James considers why the Civil War would be fought and the implications for his family and his community. He says, "I considered the Northern white stance against slavery. How much of the desire to end the institution was fueled by a need to quell and subdue white guilt and pain? Was it just too much to watch? Did it offend Christian sensibilities to live in a society that allowed that practice?" Listening to James's statement, we might imagine substituting race for slavery and liberal for Christian, suggesting that Everett is channeling 21st century discussions about liberal guilt through James's opinion of the North's stance against slavery. Discovering where his wife and daughter have been sold, he takes Judge Thatcher to the island and carries away books that again will help him envision a new life based on the ethic of natural rights. Voltaire, John Stuart Mill, and a narrative of some slave, which turns out to be William Wells Brown, who wrote a very important slave narrative. In the final scenes, after he and his wife and daughter run to freedom in Iowa, he declares his independence to a local sheriff by using his self-chosen name. I am James. James what? Just James. Like Frederick Douglass, James has given himself a new name. The ritual renaming of slaves became a means by which to further dehumanize and possess another human being. Douglass, in his 1845 narrative, explains that despite the need to take on different aliases to avoid capture, he gave a white friend the privilege of choosing me a name, but told him he must not take from me the name of Frederick. I must hold on to that to preserve a sense of my identity. Both Twain and Everett employ a racial slur to describe African Americans, yet Everett's novel ends with James refusing to identify himself in the sheriff's terms and proclaiming his independence. So, by examining the antebellum world through the eyes of the intelligent, well-read, and incisive James, we as readers experience the horrors and degradation of slavery, as well as identify with the power and complexity of the human condition. But we also share in Everett's recognition that the power of Twain's writing and humor provide the inspiration for his work. As Everett writes, acknowledging Twain's influence, his humor and humanity affected me long before I became a writer. Heaven for the climate, hell for my long-awaited lunch with Mark Twain. And now I'd like to open the discussion once again to other questions and comments. And I would love to hear more about your views of the novel, what it does, what it innovates for you, what it does new or differently, or other connections that perhaps you see to Twain. Yes.
As you travel in different parts of the country, particularly in the South, the language is particularly different than we understand it here. So if you go back to the time, the period of the book, a language on the black side was toned along with music to a certain degree, and the landowners didn't understand that language. However, the slaves didn't understand the landowners' dialects.
Exactly.
Because, let's say, they were heavily Irish,
Mm-hmm.
or heavily Scottish,
Mm-hmm.
or to a lesser extent German.
Mm-hmm.
So that in and of itself limited any kind of communication.
I think actually you're making a point that John McWhorter makes as well. So there was an article that appeared only a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, and McWhorter's a linguist, so his understanding of the language really has to do with its origins. And what he says is that essentially that the language that was being spoken by enslaved people really follows the pattern that other non-standard English or dialects have, even in other parts of the world, that they are taken from an exposure that they had through the language that was being spoken by the plantation owners, and as you said, that was often infused with British and Irish influence. So that was the language that they were developing. But I think he is, I think, disputing the point in the novel that those characters could in fact be using this type of dialect deliberately, right? On the other hand, I think what Everett has done that's so really fascinating is he has depicted almost flawlessly the dialect, that is, the representation of black speech, in novels by Twain or Harry Beecher Stowe. And so I feel that he's also in dialogue with those writers. He is dealing with the question of the ways in which African Americans are depicted in those, the characters are depicted speaking a language that is an exaggeration of a dialect. And that, I think that in some ways prevents us as 21st century readers from fully appreciating their dignity. And I think that may be part of what's going on here. We don't expect to, I mean, that is so far from the way I think novelists write today, that to see him do that is really pretty much a stroke of genius to do it with Twain in mind. So thank you for that. Other thoughts? Or ideas that you had, particular passages that may have interested you, that you were wondering about as well.
After the snake bite
Mm-hmm.
on the island,
Mm-hmm.
when he hallucinates,
Yes.
Rousseau comes in his room and,
Mm-hmm.
or in his space, I found that fascinating.
Yes,
If you could speak it
Yeah.
to that at all.
it's a great.
Yeah, I think these are moments where he is beginning to feel the freedom to imagine his an existence outside of the one that he normally lives in. And Rousseau had theories actually about language, about the idea that actually he was very much against slavery, wrote a famous treatise on the origins of languages, and thought of actually people who came from, who were enslaved or indigenous people as being less acculturated, more in that way unsullied by the effects of culture. So I could see how he would feel, the idea that Rousseau is sympathetic to that view. I see those scenes very much like the ones with Rousseau and also Voltaire. And then towards the end, there's a discussion with John Locke that gives him the rational tools to stage his personal rebellion. Because at the end, Locke he's talking to Locke about warfare. And he says, so it is right to act against people who you feel are oppressing you. And basically Locke agrees. So that he's kind of channeling these great characters in a way that gives him permission to revolt. So I think there's an interesting study to be made there, because clearly Everett chooses them somewhat carefully.
This isn't a question, I listened to the book as well as reading it,
Mm-hmm.
and the actor who's the narrator on the audiobook is unbelievably
Fantastic.
great.
Yeah.
And it's only one person.
Uh-huh.
Whereas I started to read husband, wife, master, slave, if I have the order of the words right of that. And that's like 6 different actors are the voices, whereas Dominic Hoffman does
Yes.
it all.
Brilliant.
Yes, that's for me for the summer. That's one of those, I have not looked at that. I think that would be wonderful, because I could imagine it would be really, really powerful when it's done well. The whole question, I think, of language and the code switching becomes really interesting. Another one of my colleagues has just written an article, which is currently under review, in which she is looking at the ways in which that issue of code switching that we see in Everett's novel, it also appears, elements of it appear in the interviews done with the last generation of living slaves through the Federal Writers Project, the FWP, in the 1930s. So this whole idea of speaking in a dialect, speaking about things or issues that you think will please the interviewer, and then gaining an audience so that even African-American listeners found that a particularly compelling performance. That's already evident in some of the interviewing. So even though, I have no idea if Everett was familiar with those sorts of interviews, that suggests that there actually might be some sort of element of truth in this, but again.
Now, is code switching a long-standing term? Because to me, it's
Yes.
a relatively new term
Right.
and concept, but
It is, I mean, within, I think, language and studies and linguistics, code switching means the idea of being able to move from one register of language into another. You know, I mean, we could get, especially thinking about like who code switches and who doesn't, that becomes intriguing. For example, President Obama never code switched, right? He stayed within standard English speech always, whereas other people might, like Michelle Obama. Okay, so, I mean, the idea is you are moving between those registers, I think, to also suggest your particular political or social affiliation, because now you've become a member of another community. What's intriguing about Everett's novel is that James has mastered the ability to do both, right, flawlessly, and he manipulates it. So he uses it in situations where he knows that he needs to for his survival, right?
he teaches it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, he teaches
Yeah.
that, and he teaches the behavior. I'm curious about how people also view the final scenes, because to me, the final scenes are, well, those were difficult, you know, violent. I envision this as a Quentin Tarantino film, ultimately, because it has all the elements of a movie like Django Unchained, but that he moves into that, it's a very apocalyptic scene.
I found that James stayed a sympathetic character, but I'm not sure that everybody would see it that way, but I felt he stayed as a sympathetic character even at that moment.
Yeah, he does go up to see his daughter and his wife. Was there a question in the back?
I was
Yes.
just gonna say, this is pretty obvious, but I really enjoyed the way I remember reading Huckleberry Finn to my son when he was younger, and fast-paced, dynamo action, scene after scene, the way he was able to continue that, and James just really tremendous amount of excitement and never a dull moment.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm sure he drew huge inspiration obviously from
Yeah,
Twain.
yeah. Yeah, I felt very much like this book was written for a 21st century audience. Whereas Huckleberry Finn, as you probably noticed, is much looser. And T.S. Eliot talks about the fact that it's a series of vignettes essentially, where they go off the river, back onto the river. But there's also complexity in Twain that I think one needs to acknowledge. For example, the fact that Huck never really uses slurs about Jim. When he's on the river, it's Jim, but it's when he is in front of other white people that he,
He switches.
yes, exactly. So there's that sense that he is also hyper conscious of the situation in which he finds himself. Again, another survival strategy, right, but for different reasons. Yes.
Well, that actually struck me about both Huck and about James, that they were both going through this process of navigating, how do I get to the person that I want to be? How do I survive along the way?
Mhm.
What pieces of myself do I risk losing as I navigate that? And I just found the way that both of them were depicted in their relationship, it was almost heartbreaking, it was so beautiful.
Yeah.
I loved the relationship between the two of them, so it wasn't surprising to me at the end that he would have them be father and son, because you wanted them to be, because it made sense that they would be, that they were both outsiders and searching, and you just knew intuitively that Pappy could not be a piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, how interesting. Yeah, it's, I mean, also, of course, again, this would have, I don't even think this was part of Twain's consciousness. This
No,
is really
No, but,
the idea that that they could have that kind of relationship, again, is, I think, Everett's way of drawing us into this story, but also, it's very moving in its way, because then Jim is, Huck goes off to take a side in the war, and James is still on the run, has to go see his, reaches for his family. But I agree, it's a moment of like emotional commitment that is really quite moving and beautiful. Yeah. Any other ideas? So I'm hoping that now I'm going to go listen to the reading of this, because it's obviously moving. And I'd be curious to hear about other sorts of books that you have been reading, or particularly for Black History Month, since we're in the month of February. But I think that this was an inspired choice, so I appreciate being given the opportunity to talk more with you about it.
oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.